Hello and good afternoon, everyone. We're very sorry for the inconvenience caused in the morning due to poor internet connectivity in Kashmir. We were not able to live stream the morning's talk, but thankfully now I hope, keeping our fingers crossed, I hope that we will be able to do this now. If there is any inconvenience caused due to connectivity, please bear with us. We will try to be back as soon as possible. Um, so, I am Mehreen and I'll be hosting today's session for you. We at WRCF are presenting a series of talks by eminent scientists and researchers from Kashmir and outside. And during this Wildlife Week, which starts from the 2nd of October, which is today, till 8th of October. These talks will highlight various aspects of research and the status of wildlife conservation, especially in Kashmir. On the screen, we have Dr. Anzar A Khuroo with us, and we will start today's session by his um, talk. Dr. Anzar is a senior assistant professor in the University of Kashmir at the Center of Biodiversity and Taxonomy. His research interests include taxonomy, ecology, and biodiversity. He is a recipient of a Young Scientist Award by the Department of Science and Technology, JNK, and a visiting fellow to the Institute of Botany, Chinese Academy of Science, Beijing, by Indian National Academy of Science. He has served as country editor for IUCN-led Global Register of Introduced and Invasive Species and is presently serving as associate editor for the journal Conservation Science and section editor Botany for Checklist. Without further ado, I hand over the floor to Dr. Anzar. Please, sir.
Good afternoon. First of all, I must apologize the inconvenience caused to the participants who were eager to listen in the morning session because of some internet connectivity issues here. But I hope this time we'll be lucky enough to make it. When Dr. Marin told me that so from 2nd of October, there is going to be Wildlife Week, we wish to have you one of your lectures in this particular week, I thought what to talk about. To me, the first thing that came is my first, I believe, that is from morning to evening throughout the day that I work with, that I deal with, is biodiversity. And that's why I thought it is better for me to, although not possible completely, to do justice with this topic, but in order to attempt one synthesis summary of Biodiversity of Jammu and Kashmir. And that's the title of this session's lecture. And this particular lecture, I believe, will be apt for the Wildlife Week talk series that this Wildlife Conservation Research Conservation Foundation has started from 2nd of October today. Without going into the further details, I believe briefly who I am. I'm Anzar A Khuroo. Dr. Marin already gave a brief introduction about me. I'm a faculty member in University of Kashmir in the Department of Botany. Professionally, I'm a botanist, yes. But that means I have a passion for plants, flowers. But along with plants and flowers, I also like to see other types of organisms as well, and really get attracted towards those organisms also. But I cannot claim expertise in those groups other than few groups of plants. But this particular talk, there will be a mix of many of the slides will be very basic in the sense because I believe this is a popular talk. There will be many students also joining this particular talk, and there will be also say eminent experts, I believe so, who may also participate, join in this particular session. So I will not keep. Please forgive me for those particular say basic slides that I have kept in this very brief presentation summarizing the biodiversity of Jammu and Kashmir. So let us start our travel to biodiversity of Jammu and Kashmir. The contents of my talk will be, first of all, I will be talking about biodiversity. First of all, why we need to talk about biodiversity? What is the driving force for us to talk about biodiversity? Because that will give us the rationale for this particular talk. Then, having this brief, say, introduction about this, why we need to talk about biodiversity, then I will straight away go to the biodiversity of Jammu and Kashmir, wherein I will be summarizing the current status. By status, I do not mean the threat or the other types of conservation. I simply mean whatever knowledge, briefly, I will try to summarize about what we know about the biodiversity of Jammu and Kashmir. And then lastly, I will be briefly flagging some of the challenges that we need to take in the immediate future. So starting with this, why we need to talk about biodiversity. From 2nd of this October, we are starting with this Wildlife Week. And what is its connection with biodiversity? If we know this World Wildlife Day, it's not celebrated from 2nd of October to 8th of October. It's basically throughout the world, it is celebrated on 3rd of March. 3rd of March 2020, this year, the World Wildlife Day, its theme was sustaining all life on Earth. We know from very earlier times, this wildlife was mostly focusing on megafauna, the higher charismatic animals. But of late, with biodiversity coming into picture, this wildlife is now almost synonymous with biodiversity. And that's why the theme of World Wildlife Day 2020, that was celebrated way back in 3rd of March, was sustaining all life. It was not sustaining wildlife, it was sustaining all life. And that all life is what we call as, in simpler terms, biodiversity. Along with this sustainability, which is quite buzzing these days, this is a trending from last 1 decade or so, UN, few years back, they tried to develop some sustainable development goals, what are called as SDGs. There were 17 sustainable development goals that were developed by UN. Before these sustainable development goals, there were Millennium Development Goals. As we know, there was not much progress achieved in, say, meeting those sustainable Millennium Development Goals. That's why this transformation towards SDGs. And now, in 2020, it is now full realization that the success of all these goals, 17 goals, whether they are related to economy, whether they are related to society, the central pillar for it is biodiversity. If there is something if there is something problem with biodiversity, then we will not be able to achieve any tangible progress in other sustainable development goals. That's why today it is 2nd of October, 2 days before, on 30th September, just 1 day before, in United States, at United Nations, there was a summit called on biodiversity. It was not a summit on COVID, that we know we are presently under the COVID pandemic, but the urgency for convening this global summit on biodiversity was because there is urgent need felt that we must have action on biodiversity, because then and only we can achieve sustainable development. The theme of this particular summit was urgent action on biodiversity for sustainable development. Why I am say highlighting these global scenario about biodiversity? This is very important. What is happening at the global level that has ultimately bearing at national level and regional level as well. It's not in 30th September, 2 days before, that United Nations is concerned about this biodiversity. Way back in 2010 also, United Nations, UN, celebrated this 2010 as the International Year of Biodiversity. Again, the theme was biodiversity is life, biodiversity is our life. And buoyed by the success of this International Year of Biodiversity 2010, they recognized the entire decade from 2010 to 2020 as United Nations Decade on Biodiversity. Very recently, 1 year before, last May in 2019, a global biodiversity assessment report was released by IPBES. IPBES is basically an organization, a global organization, just like in case of climate change, we have IPCC. Same is the case with biodiversity. That's called as Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The main message from this particular report that was released last year was that there are 1 million species. In our terms, there are 10 lakh species of plants and animals that are at the risk of extinction in coming days. And that was basically the cause of concern for all the scientists as well as for the political leadership across the globe. Let us see this year 2020. It's believed that all the misfortune has come in this year 2020. From COVID-19 to biodiversity collapse. We know we have the economic recession that is going on. We know we have the climate change, sometimes we call as climate emergency. And then top of it, we have this biodiversity collapse. It's not on the side of environmentalists always. From the economic point of view, many people blame these environmentalists that they are not looking onto the socio-economic aspects of society. And that's why in 2020, this year, World Economic Forum. We know World Economic Forum is convened every year in Davos, Switzerland. And that's basically, you can say, this is a forum for the capitalists, corporate world. This World Economic Forum too recognized that this biodiversity loss, whether it's from the likelihood or from the impact point of view, out of the 5 challenges that the humanity is currently facing, this biodiversity loss is one amongst them. Just 15 September, 1 week before, 5th edition of Global Biodiversity Outlook came. This is basically a flagship report that is being published by Convention on Biological Diversity. It again raised the alarm bells about the declining biodiversity across the world. We know this flagship report, the IUCN, each year they come out with red list. This year too, it's in its second version. There are the total number of, now it is more than 1 lakh species that are being assessed by IUCN as per their standards. Out of the total, say if they have assessed 100 species, 27 species are facing risks of extinction. They are threatened with extinction. That means almost, we can say, 1/3 of the global biodiversity from this estimate is threatened with extinction based on the empirical criteria that this IUCN is using. This year 2020 has been the year of reports, all pointing towards this global biodiversity loss. Just one day, yesterday, I believe 1 day or 2 days before, Kew is considered to be we call it as a quote unquote Mecca of plant sciences. Previously, they used to come out with status of state of the world's plants, but this year they added fungi to it. Wherein they are saying this report, just 1 day before this report has come, global report has come, it is estimated that out of 5 plant species, 2 are facing the threats of extinction. That is talking about plants specifically. Not only plants, in case of animals also, the typical so-called wildlife, what we used to call as earlier times, mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles. Recently, this is basically a biannual report. World Wildlife Fund and Zoological Society of London, they together come with this biannual report under the title Living Planet Report 2020. This year, just 1 or 2 weeks before this came, this shows, it basically monitors the data right from 1970 to 2020. That means last 50 years, the population abundance data of these many groups of vertebrates. And it shows that there has been a decline of 68%. On average, there has been a decline of 68% in the population abundance of all these vertebrate groups since 1970. Again, pointing to the same grim scenario, to the gloomy scenario that we are losing biodiversity. Okay, we cannot escape from the COVID crisis. COVID is here. We have to live with this COVID. A term, a trend, a hashtag that is trending from the last 6 months, we know, is bending the curve. Always we try to see whether we have been able to bend the curve or not. But it's believed that it's not only the COVID curve that we have to bend. There are other curves also that we as humanity have to bend. Very recently, on 10th of September, just 2 weeks before, a paper came in Nature. Nature is the flagship journal in science across the world, wherein they put out the different scenarios. One scenario, what in IPCC, in climate change, this is also called as business as usual. The way we are doing the things this time, the human activities, if we go by this, then there is going to be a sharp decline by 2050 and then 2100, by the end of this century, in the global biodiversity. One aspect that they talked about, that if we increase the conservation efforts, that there is a chance across the world, if we double up our conservation efforts, that we can bend this curve. We can bend this curve of biodiversity loss. That means it can regain again by the end of this century, that is 2100. The point that I want to bring home is that this bending curve is not only true for COVID, this bending the curve is also relevant for biodiversity as well. The same global biodiversity outlook that I talked about, it came out with what are the alternatives, what are those increasing conservation efforts by virtue of which we can bend this curve of biodiversity loss. We know all these things, but they tried to re-emphasize these ways how. That means we have to produce whatever production systems we have across the world. We have to transform them into sustainable production systems. We have to reduce the pressures of various drivers on biodiversity. I need not to explain further those. All of us know what are the drivers. And we have to somehow mitigate the climate change impacts, and we have to conserve and restore. In fact, may I add here that 2010 to 2020 was UN decade for biodiversity. Now 2020 to 2030 is being celebrated. It has declared by the UN that it will be celebrated as decade of ecological restoration, ecosystem restoration. That means 2020 to 2030 will be a decade for ecological restoration. As I in the starting slide, I mentioned that there will be many students here. That's why just a brief mention, a leaf from the history, what all this biodiversity is all about, because we must be very much clear about our concepts, what we mean by biodiversity. As we all know that this biodiversity came after the National Forum on Biodiversity in 1986. Then a edited book was published by Edward Wilson in 1988. And then this basically led to the resulted in a global environmental awareness about this biodiversity, only with the Convention on Biological Diversity, that also is known as UN Earth Summit, that was held in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, way back in 1992. If we see the historical chronology of this from 1992, when it was started, when this Convention on Biological Diversity started. In fact, may I add here one more point? It's not only the Convention on Biological Diversity that was basically signed in Rio Earth Summit. There was also the IPCC, this Climate Change Convention, and this Desertification Convention. These three conventions were the outcome of UN Earth Summit. Initially, Climate Change Convention that was too much that led to the global headlines, but very recently, of late, this biodiversity too is reaching to this that policy framework. Then different years of its journey from this 1992 onwards. In 2010, we had some targets. Global community recognized some targets, what we call as HE biodiversity targets, in the just released Global Biodiversity Outlook, it is clearly confessed that we have almost failed in meeting those targets. And in October, there is a lot of nowadays negotiations going on that we must have some global framework which will be implemented ultimately post 2020. In fact, we had one COP, Conference of Parties, that was scheduled to be held in Kunming, that is Yunnan province of China, but because of COVID, that has been now rescheduled for 2021. Again, the core concept, because when I will be summarizing the results about the biodiversity of Jammu and Kashmir, I'll be talking in these ways. Let us go to the basics, core concept of biodiversity. Taking the CBD's Convention on Biological Diversity definition, which defines biological diversity as the variability among living organisms. That variability can be in different types of ecosystems, whether it is terrestrial ecosystem, marine, or other aquatic ecosystem. I don't know why those who led to this formulation of this definition, why they kept marine and aquatic. Perhaps they were interested in keeping the freshwater ecosystem separate from the marine ecosystems. That's why this. And one more part of this definition is the ecological complexes of which they are a part. The living organisms, they are part of various ecological complexes. And this is also another dimension of biological diversity, biodiversity concept. Of late, although there has been some focus towards this ecological complex dimension of biodiversity, but until very recently we don't have much data about this aspect of biodiversity, about this dimension of biodiversity throughout the world, not to talk about the developing world and then coming to the Jammu and Kashmir. This includes diversity within species, commonly we call it as a genetic diversity, or the diversity that we have in populations, between species, what we call as species diversity, and of the ecosystems, the ecosystem diversity. All these levels of biodiversity, they are hierarchically, mutually inclusive. They come, that means if you have an ecosystem diversity, that in turn comprises of the species diversity. Species diversity in turn comprised of the genetic diversity. Now, coming to our Jammu and Kashmir, why we have this Jammu and Kashmir? Where it is located, because geography is always very important, very crucial in determining the biodiversity a particular region occupies, what we usually study under biogeography. Himalaya, we know that it is a global biodiversity hotspot. Out of the 36 biodiversity hotspots, previously we had 34 only, but now we have added 2 more, one in Australia and one in North America. 36 biodiversity hotspots we have. This Himalaya is one of the biodiversity hotspots. And it comprises a large area starting from the Hindu Kush on one side, and then the temperate regions of Myanmar hills, and on the other side, the Hongdon mountains in this China, Yunnan province. All this range is what we call as Himalaya. It is spread across many different countries, starting on one side, the Afghanistan, on western side, on the eastern side, you have this Myanmar on that side of the border. This is what is Himalaya. And within Himalaya, in the northwestern part of the Himalaya, we have a region, but previously we used to have 3 different regions, Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh. Now we have only Jammu and Kashmir region. This Jammu and Kashmir region, the biodiversity importance of this Jammu and Kashmir is basically, we can take it from the way it has the wide altitudinal gradient, because it's the altitude that makes it to support, that makes it to have the flourishing of such a huge biodiversity. Say with every change in altitude, let us take 100 meters, you have a completely different type of vegetation. If you have a different type of vegetation, naturally you have the different other types of organisms, whether they are butterflies, whether they are birds, whether they are mammals, whether they are microbes, they too differ along with the vegetation. That means this altitude is basically the determinant of the diversity in Jammu and Kashmir. And it can range right from the border of Jammu and Kashmir with Punjab, wherein the altitude can be 113 to it can reach to the higher these peaks to 8,000 meters. Normally, we recognize in Jammu and Kashmir the lower Himalayan Shivalik hills that fall in mostly in Jammu. Then the Jammu and Kashmir, they are separated by one range, what we call as Pir Panchal Himalaya. And then Kashmir and Ladakh, they are separated from each other, what we call as broadly as Greater Himalaya. And then you have on the other side the Ladakh mountains. That is a physiographic way of delimiting the region what we call as Jammu and Kashmir. Now, after this rather, I can say, reasonably broad perspective on global, why we need to talk about the biodiversity, what is the so much urgency to talk about biodiversity, and then talking about where Jammu and Kashmir falls physiographically. Now, let me go straight away to this biodiversity of the Jammu and Kashmir current status. I'll be talking here about the various. I'm not an expert on all the groups of organisms. I can be much comfortable in plants, but whatever I have summarized here is from the published studies on other groups of organisms. And it is not possible for me to give the details of all the groups of organisms. I'll be making very brief mention of the different type of groups that we have in biological organisms, whether in plants or animals, and then giving very brief, very summarized figures about their diversity. Before I will move to this summarizing the diversity of different life forms in Jammu and Kashmir, it's very important for us that this biodiversity, although it is different, it is heterogeneity, but it has a unification value. Just like in case of this, we call it unity in diversity. That's why this tree of life approach nowadays, the phylogenetic approach that we see in biology these days, all the branches that are that we have the different groups of that are represented by different groups of organisms, they are unified into the base in a single branch, in single say origin they arise from, and then they branch into different groups of organisms. What we recognize as the tips under the different groups of, say, whether in plants, animals, or microbes, eubacteria or orchibacteria, or different types of groups that are on the right side of my slide. I don't know whether it will be on your right side or left side. The different groups of, traditionally, the different groups of organisms that we recognize, say in case of plants, Angiosperms, Gymnosperms, moving down to the algae. In case of, say, animals, the topmost, the mammals, and then moving to the say invertebrates, and then in case of these microbes, the eubacteria, true bacteria, and the orchibacteria. These are the different groups of organs that are recognized under the life across the world, and I will be taking this approach in summarizing the diversity of different forms of life in Jammu and Kashmir. So let's start with the bottom of the pyramid in plants. Why I start? I have no bias for plants and animals, but it's always believed from, say, plants start the life. It's the plants that start the life because of the photosynthesis. And that's why I'm not taking it as a bias. I'm a botanist. That's why I've selected from the algae. We know from this particular two different regions of Jammu and Kashmir, all this data that I am sharing here will be from a recent book that we compiled, and roughly about 80 different contributors, they contributed to this compilation of the biodiversity of the Jammu and Kashmir. I will be taking the key messages, key findings in different groups of organisms. In case of algae, a total of 1,065 taxa of algae have been recorded from these different regions. And it's believed that Basidiophyceae, that is the diatoms, they are dominant as compared to the Chlorophyceae. By taxa, those who are not from, say, botany background, or those who do not understand why I have not written here the taxa, why I have not written species. There are many kinds of organisms, what we simply call as species. We are not sure whether they are mostly below the species. They are the sub kinds of those organisms. We call them as subspecies, we call them as variety. And that's why we use a neutral term, taxa, a group of organisms for these different groups of organisms. This is more a taxonomic term, a science, a discipline in botany or zoology that deals with naming, identification, and classification of living organisms. I must make it clear here that although these have been recorded here, but the limitation for this is that we don't have enough of voucher specimens available for this group of organisms. I don't know, as of now, to my best understanding, we don't have much of the voucher specimens. Voucher specimens are those specimens, reference specimens, which a researcher or anybody who is interested in whether this particular species is here or not, these voucher specimens from scientific point of view are very important. In case of algae, that voucher reference systems, we don't have. And that's why we have to take these results with a pinch of salt. And there is a lot of scope in working in these groups, especially the lower groups, not only in plants but in animals as well. And this is not a final word. Whatever the figures I will be sharing here, these are not the final words. This is just preliminary. This is just reference where from we have to, this will just make a beginning where from we have to start. Then moving to the traditional way of doing fungi, although fungi are considered to be now a separate kingdom under mycelia. Under fungi, there are as per the citation that I am on the bottom of this particular slide, 548 species of fungi. They include both the macrofungi as well as microfungi. They have been reported from Jammu and Kashmir. They include both the macrofungi, you know, the mushrooms, the edible mushrooms. They are prized delicacies, not only here but many of these, just like the morchilla, they fetch huge market value. And other than these microfungi, there are many microfungi which are economically important. Economically important in the sense they are the causative organisms of various types of disease in our crop plants. But again, this fungi throughout the world, very recently, last 10 years, there has been a realization that this is the most hyper diverse group, and we have just touched very minuscule diversity in fungi. And same may be true in Jammu and Kashmir. We need to put our efforts to document further the fungi in Jammu and Kashmir as well. And especially I would like to mention here the metagenomics tools that are now becoming available, the environmental DNA tools that are now becoming available. They have facilitated to a larger extent to understand, to document, to characterize the diversity of fungi in other parts of the world, and such tools can be used here also for studying these fungi in near future. Then lichens, very important group of, whether you call them as plants or you call them as fungi. This is a symbiotic association. This is a win-win association, a win-win situation for both the algae as well as the fungi. From very earlier, from 10th grade metric, we know about what these lichens are. These lichens, we also know that they are the pioneers in the ecological succession. Top in the alpines, if you see these glacial melts, if you see the rocks, the first thing that is colonizing them is the rocks, is the lichens. It's not only lichens, they can be on the rocks, they can be on the barks also. That's why you have different types of life forms, growth forms of lichens, folios, crustose, other types of say growth forms that we recognize in lichens. And in lichens, it is recorded, I believe this, we are confident in this. In this, we are confident in the sense, not me, I believe the studies that have been conducted, that 424 species of lichens have been recorded, and disproportionately 18% of the total lichen species in India. That means this particular region does not represent 18% of the total area in the India, but from lichen point of view, we have 18% of the lichens that have been recorded from India. They have their representative in this Jammu and Kashmir. That means from this lichen point of view, the diversity of lichens is too much here in Jammu and Kashmir as compared to other regions. Then moving further in that ecology, this evolutionary ladder, where I started from the algae, now I have reached in this step of bryophytes. These bryophytes, traditionally we recognize them into three different groups, what we call as liverworts. In between you have hornworts, and then you have mosses. And these are mostly the shade and moisture loving plants. Again, they are different. How they are different from algae? We know that algae, they don't have the true stems, they have a thallus structure, but here liverworts, although they have thallus, although we have few liverworts which are foliose also, but these liverworts, they are considered to be these liverworts and hornworts. If we talk about liverworts and hornworts from these two different regions, 420 species have been total recorded from Jammu and Kashmir, out of which majority are mosses, 328 species, and 91 are liverworts. This, by saying 91, 328 does not mean that this is a fixed figure, but this is a reference figure where from we have to start further. Until very recently, we were knowing that we don't have any hornwort this representative, but researchers from Jammu University, perhaps from the Jammu University, where this bryophyte has been an area of specialization, one hornwort Pioceros leavis has been recorded from district Rajaury, a hornwort. That means now we have one more one hornwort representative here in Jammu and Kashmir as well. And again, I must emphasize here, because this is a lower group of organism, what you see with eyes, you appreciate it. That's why we had always this megafauna bias, studying these charismatic animals. But these bryophytes, they need further investigation, and there are a lot of discoveries that are waiting to be say unraveled to the science if we focus on this particular group of organisms as well. And they are not only, they may seem to be, they are not economically important, but from ecological point of view, they are very important. And ecological services, they are not only say services which we should take as free, they are as important, they are as crucial as the economic goods that we derive from these vegetation or other types of biodiversity. Then moving further, one more step to this ladder of diversity of life, we reached this pteridophytes. In case of pteridophytes, almost approximately 200 species have been reported from this Jammu and Kashmir, and out of which majority, 190 around, they are ferns. Ferns are the true ferns, and then there are also some fern allies. And we know there are many fern allies, say Equistum, that's basically a fern ally, and you have Ophioglossum, you have many different ferns which are whose representatives you have in Kashmir, in Jammu as well as in Kashmir. And again, these particular species, this group of organisms is not enough work has not been done in this. We need more work on this. Although we have a preliminary catalog of this pteridophytes here in Jammu and Kashmir, but as I mentioned, that this is a lower group of organisms, that much attention has not been paid to this group of plants as compared to the higher groups of organisms that I will just come to, that I will be just in the next few slides that I will be talking about. And this particular ferns, they are not only they are ornamentally very gracious, they are very they can be the future ornamentals, and they are economically also important. Many of these ferns, they are used in our traditional medicine also. And then there are many ferns, they have a very more, and we don't know, let's accept we don't know their much they have their ecological role, but we have still very little studies have been gone into how they are say important from the ecological functioning and ecological structuring point of view in ecosystems. Then moving to the next step, we reach to the Gymnosperms. Although Gymnosperms, the number of species that have been reported are only 41, and out of this, half of these occur in wild, and many of these we cultivate as ornamentals. And about these Gymnosperms, although the number is less, but in Jammu and Kashmir, they occupy a huge area. Whatever your forests are, whatever we have the forests here, majority of majority of these plants that form the forests in Jammu and Kashmir, they are Gymnosperms, the various conifers. Whether you start right from the Jammu hills to the top of the alpines here in Kashmir, while in the top you have the Abies spectacles. In the lower hills, you can have the Pinus roxburghi in Jammu Shivalik hills. And then in between, you have the citrus, the magnificent Himalayan cedar, and also you have many what we consider as nowadays the threatened species like Taxus walchiana. Until recently, we used to call it as Taxus walchiana, but there are evidences, some papers from Nepal and Chinese Academy of Sciences which are saying that this is not Taxus walchiana, this is Taxus contata. And then we have ephedra as well. Although ephedra is mostly in Ladakh, but we have few populations, last remaining populations of ephedra in Kashmir also here as well. And in addition to these, we have a ginkgo biloba that is cultivated here, and that is also gaining more significance from their medicinal point of view throughout the world. And same can be perhaps some studies have been conducted in III and here also trying to see how much medicinal importance we can have from these ginkgo biloba. And moving to, in addition to these wild growing Gymnosperms, we have also several Gymnosperms which we grow in our parks and gardens and along our landscape. Then the top of it, in case of plants, we have the Angiosperms, that is the flowering plants. For a layman, the plants are flowers. For a layman, for a common citizen, the plants are flowers because they catch the attention. almost as of now 5,000 taxa are recorded from this Jammu and Kashmir. And by taxa, I mean to say, I have already mentioned that there are some of the subspecies. That's why we use the word taxa in order to be more. It starts from, you can have your the spice of Kashmir, that is the saffron, and then you can have many of the spiritual, the many plants which have some mythological say importance linked with it, like this Susurya sacra, or other plants, different plants which are named after particular localities. Or on the left bottom of the left of the slide, you have this Platanus orientalis, which is across the different landscapes of Kashmir. Or you have other types of plants that grow in Jammu as well, which are many of these which are threatened also. And then some aconitum's or Ernebia or Kashmir, this Delphinium Kashmiriana. Many of the species, they are also specifically named after a particular, from this particular region as well. The point I want to bring home by summarizing these angiosperms is that we have a huge diversity of angiosperms, By saying that we have 5,000, this does not mean we end here. This does not mean that there will be not new species. This does not also mean that there will be not wrong identifications. But this is a reference point where from we can start. Previously, we used to have a notion that Eastern Himalaya, say other parts of the Himalaya, they are rich in biodiversity as compared to the Western Himalaya. But we believe now that Western Himalaya, because of its altitudinal gradient, is equally as diverse as Eastern Himalaya. Although from species richness point of view per square meter area, Eastern Himalaya is going to, I believe that is more diverse. But in terms of the number of species, because of the huge altitudinal gradient, we have a huge diversity here as well in Western Himalaya. Now, after traveling through this plant world, starting from algae to angiosperm, now let's have a brief travel around the animal world as well, starting from the basic one, that's the ants. I will, just like in case of plants, I talked about all the different kinds of organisms, but in case of animals, we don't have much information available because you have a huge diversity, especially in insects. And that's why although that much say information or compilation we don't have available, but this is just a beginning. Maybe this type of work may say trigger such type of studies in other groups of animals as well. In case of ants, I must acknowledge here the work of Dr. Ejaz Wajku, who has made significant contribution in ant fauna of this particular region. And 190, about 200 ant taxa are reported from this Jammu and Kashmir as of now. And again, it's not an end itself. A lot of work need to be done on this particular area as well. Then moving to the butterflies, the beautiful butterflies. Butterflies are very important. They are not only attractive, they are important from the plant point of view. As I mentioned in the definition of the CBD, the ecological complexes of which they are a part. We have not much plant-insect interaction. That is the very important, that is the fundamental of sustenance of the biodiversity. These butterflies, roughly about 400 species have been reported here from Jammu and Kashmir. And again, this is again, say, it can be again an underestimate. We can have more species, the more work, if that is undertaken. I know of a student who is working in Baba Ghulam Shah Badshah University. She too is working on butterflies. Maybe in future we may know many other butterfly species may be added to this Jammu and Kashmir butterfly fauna. Then Diptera, one more group of animal organisms. From this, around more than 100 species have been reported from Jammu and Kashmir. Then moths. Moths are equally diverse here. About more than 450 species have been reported, with Jammu having the highest moth diversity as compared to Kashmir. And these moths are equally important from economic point of view because they are the causative agents, they are the insect pests for various types of diseases that affect our these horticultural crops. That's why we must be knowing, I again believe that this group of insects, there might be a lot of discoveries pending to be done if we delve more into investigation of the diversity of these moths as well. Then the fish, very important from economic point of view. from Jammu and Kashmir, I will be adding here the Ladakh data also. 120 species in total have been reported, and this work has been possible by a group led by Dr. A.R. Yusuf and Dr. Bhatt from SCAST, who have contributed, and other students also in Jammu as well as in Kashmir, who have contributed in documenting the fish fauna of Jammu and Kashmir. As of now, 120 species are reported from Jammu and Kashmir. Then moving to further ahead in the animal ladder of tree of life, we have the amphibians and reptiles. Again, I believe this is an underestimate. 7 species of amphibians and 63 species of reptiles have been reported. Again, but I'm a little bit perplexed that why only 7 species of amphibians? Because amphibians throughout the world, there are many groups of organisms which are facing extreme degree of threat, and amphibians are one amongst them. And we have to see in Jammu and Kashmir what is the stats of these amphibians as well. And I believe more studies are required to be undertaken from our zoologist partners in Jammu and Kashmir. Then the birds, the feathered friends, our feathered friends, very important from wildlife point of view. Charismatic birds from Jammu, moving to from the subhills of the Jammu, Shivaliks, moving to the alpines. We are having a huge diversity of birds. As of now, 550 species, more than 550 species of birds have been reported from here. They include both residents, passage migrants, summer visitors, winter visitors. We know in Kashmir as well as in Jammu, there are a lot of birds that come from the northern temperate region, Siberian area mostly, and they breed here. And again, one more point that I want to flag here, that because of the shrinkage of these wetlands, how much we are these birds, migrant birds will come here, and then how much their habitats are say suitable for their breeding purposes in future. That is basically a big star question that we have to see. Then at the top of it, we have the mammals. As of now, more than 110 species of mammals have been reported from here. Again, this is, I believe there will be no underestimate, because as true for rest of the world, mammals are almost completely documented. Same may be the case here. Although I once came a book by Vivek Menon, Wildlife Trust of India, wherein he has recognized many different species of these mammals, some of the mammals what we used to be. Some papers, some studies I have also come across from Nepal also. They have recognized some few of the mammals. Whether such mammals are here or not, that is the subject of future investigation as well. So completing our travel for this animals, now let's move a little bit about the agrobiodiversity. In case of apples, apricots, and almonds, that doesn't mean that only these types of fruits we have in Jammu and Kashmir, but the data that we have available of now. Apples, it is believed that 190 cultivars are here, apricots 45, and almond 10 cultivars. And this agrobiodiversity assumes as important as the species diversity. This is the genetic diversity that we have, and this is very important whenever because more monoculturing we have, the more and more there are threats of this pest outbreak because of this monoculturing. And for genetic improvement of these crops, we need this cultivar, we need this agrobiodiversity. Then in case of crops, whether it is maize, rice, wheat, we have a huge diversity of land races, indigenous geographical races that we need to preserve, because they are the ultimate reservoirs where from we can genetically improve our crops. How much we are able to say preserve them for posterity, that's basically a big question mark. Now, in addition to this genetic diversity, a little bit about ecosystem diversity, because in the initial slides I talked about biodiversity is not only the species diversity, although whatever information we have available is about only species diversity, but in this particular work we try to do the forest ecosystem. What are the different types of forest ecosystems here? The different types of forest ecosystem, the diversity in the ecosystem diversity in forests. We have 6 different major types of 6 different forest ecosystems we have, right from the Jammu subhills, subtropical dry evergreen, to the top of the alpines. We have the subalpine forests. In case of subalpine forests, we have these Betula utilis, that is Bojpatra, that is topping. Beyond that, you have the tree line. Beyond that, you don't have forests. In between, you have other types of forests, starting the subtropical broadleaf, you have subtropical pine, you have Himalayan moist temperate, and in Kashmir, as well as in some part of the Chenai Valley, you have Himalayan dry temperate. And we all agree that there are a lot of anthropogenic influences that are basically a big threat to these forests, starting from habitat loss to encroachment of the forest land. And there are other types of pressures, drivers that are basically leading to the loss of these forest ecosystems. These forest ecosystems throughout the world, it's believed that 80% of the terrestrial biodiversity has is found in these forest ecosystems. That means more and more you degrade it, automatically you are declining the biodiversity as well. Then aquatic ecosystems, very important from Jammu and Kashmir point of view, because we have huge lakes, right from the valley lakes to the top alpine lakes. You have different types of aquatic ecosystems. And these ecosystems, they are very important. They provide valuable economic goods, say fish or other type of, say in Kashmir, we have one, this Nilambo nucifera, Nadru, and other types of ecosystem services that we derive from these aquatic ecosystems. They are, but just like in case of forests, these aquatic ecosystems, they are also under tremendous anthropogenic pressure. I need not further elaborate on this. We know whatever the fate of our aquatic ecosystems is. Then within these aquatic ecosystems, we have the plants growing. Almost 190 different types of plants, aquatic macrophytes, different from the algae. Macrophytes, plants that make home these aquatic ecosystems. Many of the aquatic ecosystems we see in case of Dal, we know that there are some of the invasive species like Nymphaeana mexicana. Despite our huge effort, whether mechanical or manual removing, we are not able to say any progress, any success is not achieved there. And there are many of the species which we used to had previously, they are now becoming rarer. And same is maybe the case in case of Jammu aquatic bodies as well. Then medicinal plants, because it is the economy that matters ultimately. We did one study on the medicinal plants, wherein the different types of species which are used for medicinal point of view in Kashmir, Jammu, and Ladakh, almost more than 1,100 species have reported use in these three different regions. The different regions, Kashmir, Jammu, and Ladakh, they have their due share of the different types of medicinal plants. And these medicinal plants, they have the threat, although my focus of today's lecture was not talk much about the threats as well as the conservation, but still for interest, we did one work wherein we tried to see out of the various medicinal plants, there are 31 medicinal plants that we prioritized for protection because their population, they are say threatened at the present moment of time. There are various types of, on the right side of my slide, I am showing some of the pictures, which one above one is, they call it a jungly ganda, that's basically Fritillaria royale, and then you have Trillium guarnianum. There is an increasing pressure of their extraction from the natural habitats. We did some, I talked about some of this threat status. We did this threat assessment for all these 31 species. So how we did this, just one or two examples. For Podophyllum hexandrum, the threat status was vulnerable. That came by using these different types of, I used this Q-based web tool, what is called as conservation assessment tool. And based on this, it came out to be vulnerable. One more example is from Ernebia benthami, this Kahzaban. It is an endangered at present, what we believe from our studies. Aconitum heterophyllum, that is Patris, again a vulnerable species in this part of the Himalayas. Then the last part of my lecture, very briefly, I will go because I have taken a lot of time. I believe I have exceeded my time. The future challenges. There are many future challenges. Many of these challenges I have already flagged while I was talking about the different groups of organisms. The first one is the microbial diversity. This is a COVID time. Throughout the world, there is a realization that we have not done much in the diversity of these microbial world. The extent of diversity in viruses, archaea, and eubacteria in prokaryotes, what we traditionally know as kingdom Monera, this archaea and eubacteria, that's not known at all. We don't have much information about this group of organisms. Our focus must be towards this in future. Then fungi, as I already mentioned, that it is considered to be a hyperdiverse group. They are not recorded to the extent what is expected. We must be focusing on these fungi because fungi are very important from my understanding. They are very important in the below ground. In case of biodiversity, especially plants, we only talk about the above ground, but you have a huge dark diversity that is in the below ground. For plants also, majority of the processes, or in fact the major crucial processes are happening in the below ground. And in that, the role of fungi is very crucial. And that's why we need to understand this. Then Animalia, the invertebrates, the largest group, the insects especially. I don't, as per my little humble understanding, we a lot of huge diversity of insect diversity is still waiting to be discovered from this part. Especially while moving to these alpines, I have seen huge number of insects. They need to be documented. Then we have reasonable, although not for all the groups of organs, we have reasonable information available about species diversity, but very little information about genetic diversity and ecosystem diversity. We need to have focus towards that, because nowadays, if as I talked about, that 2020 2030 is going to be the ecological restoration decade. Unless we know the diversity of ecosystems, till then we must have a scientific basis for initiating these ecological restoration campaigns. Lastly, we have very little information about the threat stats of biodiversity, whether it is species or ecosystems. Earlier times, we used to had mostly the red list of species by IUCN. But in recent times, very recently, 1 or 2 years before, IUCN has come up with one more framework for red listing these ecosystems as well. Still, we have very little information about the species, but our focus, we should not be behind. We must do something about the ecosystem red listing as well. And in near future, there are huge challenges that are waiting to be harnessed by the scientists as well as the society at large, general public, because we need to fill the knowledge gaps in order to document the precious biodiversity of these two Himalayan regions, because that is going to be very crucial for the conservation and sustainable use in these regions. Because unless what we cannot measure, what we cannot recognize, what we cannot characterize, we cannot manage it well. Blindly, we cannot do any conservation. And let us confess, majority of our conservation efforts fail because we are not knowing the system in its integrity. That's all from my side. I must acknowledge all the authors. And there were 88 authors who contributed to the book Biodiversity of the Himalaya, Jammu and Kashmir. I again flag it that this is just a beginning. It's not an end. It's just a reference point. There will be many errors in it, but this is where from we have to start. And other groups of organs, which are still knowledge gaps we don't know much about, that need to be filled in this. All my teachers, mentors, all my well-wishers, my research scholars, all the students that I have taught over the last, I believe, more than 1 decade, who have that has been always a learning experience for me. The various funding agencies, the national funding agencies, whether it is DST, whether it is MOEF BSI, whether it is ISRO or DBT or other DST, all the funding agencies that have funded us in different projects, and that has enabled us to do some work, some humble work. And last but not least, Wildlife Conservation and Research Foundation, who started this initiative of this lecture. I will be failing in my duty if I do not acknowledge Professor G.S. Dar, who was the pioneer, who was the leader in initiating this work, Biodiversity of the Himalaya. All credit must go to Professor Dar for initiating, triggering this particular initiative. And again, I re-emphasize that this is just a start. We have to move further. And a single person cannot do. It's the teamwork that makes dream work. I believe it's the teamwork that makes the dream work. And just like we have a small lab in our University of Kashmir, we call it as a BIOTA lab, Biodiversity and TAxonomy BIOTA lab. Many of the past and present members of students who have worked under me for their research degree, their contribution is due, whatever I talk about. Last, thanks, a message that is from the wildlife point of view. That's very important. Some Stephen Glaster, recently he quoted, I got this quote from Twitter, but he quotes, I quote him: people realize that forests are the lungs of earth. Usually we talk about forests are the lungs of earth, but we must also be mindful that wildlife is the blood of the forest. With this message, I thank all the participants from here in Jammu and Kashmir as well as outside the state who have patiently listening to this lecture. Thank you. And again, I apologize. I regret the inconvenience caused in the morning session. I will be pleased to take any questions, queries, or comments, whatever they are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a very informative talk, and I'm very thankful that you delivered it very well. You started all the way from algae to ants to birds and mammals, and you shared very recent findings in these phyla. I was just curious to know how important are these numbers for a common person. If we talk to a layman, how are these numbers important for them?
Numbers, huh?
Ji.
Hmm. Numbers are important. Number is what ultimately what is important in our daily life also. Say, let us take about, we usually talk about the net worth of Ambani is this much. This is basically the number that we are talking about. The same you take in case of biodiversity also. Say, we recognize many different regions as biodiversity hotspot. It's basically on the basis of numbers.
Hmm.
See, and that's why this number is very important.
Important point.
In some cases, I talked about that in lichens, we have more than 450 species, which is more than about 18% of the biodiversity. Say tomorrow, if you have the conservation planning, designing, or any other, any other sustainable, say, management of a particular resource, any part of the biodiversity, I believe this number is where from we have to start.
Okay, yeah, I agree to what you're saying. We have a few questions. I will take first question here for you. Here is by Ms. Kesang Bhutia. She says she's just curious to know your take on the involvement of general public regarding conservation through programs like citizen science awareness, etc. Uh,
Very important point Ms. Bhutia has highlighted. Very important point. Because let us accept all across the world, it is now realization that this conservation campaign has not succeeded the way it should have. Reason being, we have kept conservation separate from the public. Unless public is motivated, it's the public participation that will make conservation campaign, the environmental conservation campaign, to succeed. I believe here citizen science is very important. In fact, this particular initiative, this today's lecture, is one of the effort towards that citizen science, wherein we involve the general public. Because unless you involve, unless you motivate, you make people to realize that how important it is for their own welfare to safeguard the biodiversity. Till then, even if on the governmental level or from the institutional point of view, university or institutional point of view, how much research we do, how much, say, scientific findings we make, and they are not going to be translated into the actual, say, ground till public participation is there. And that's why I believe many of the schemes that are under the government, say various schemes under different, say, village level schemes, uh, this biodiversity conservation should be integrated in those schemes. Whether say using the schools, our students community. The best part of is teachers. As teachers, it's our responsibility how much we sensitize our students about the conservation of biodiversity, because they are our tomorrow. The more they are sensitized, more from they realize that how much this is going to be important for the survival of our own generation. Till then, very little progress is going to be achieved. I fully agree with this.
Even I also agree with this. Our research is baseless if we don't reach out to the common people and tell them that this is what we have found out. So you work in the Center for Biodiversity and Taxonomy. I want to know what is the contribution of this center in terms of biodiversity documentation and observation, and how open is this to common people?
The Center for Biodiversity is basically an associated unit of Department of Botany. Uh, the Center for Biodiversity, we have herbarium there. Herbarium, what for those who do not know herbarium is basically the collection of the plant specimens. I was talking about some voucher specimens reference. If I try to understand, make you understand, just like, say, we talk about always about cultural heritage. For that, we make those artifacts, and then we make these tahzib mahal, other types of, say, and then museums. And same is the case with, if we talk about our biodiversity heritage, these herbaria, our museums, zoological museums, our botanical gardens, they are basically the repositories where from we start. And this herbarium is globally known as CASH. It's called as acronym, Kashmir University Herbarium. We have almost now 60,000 specimens that have been collected from length and breadth of Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh. And That is the basic process where from we start in botany. Uh, if somebody is interested in knowing what is the diversity and distribution, these are basic fundamental issues. If we be more specific about the plant diversity only, these are the fundamental issues where from we have to start. If somebody is interested in biodiversity and distribution of plants in these different regions, here from you have to start. If you want to document, if you want to have an inventory, if you want to have the level of what is the level of biodiversity, and this is our repository where from you have to start. Not only here, throughout the world, whatever we know about, let's talk plant diversity or animal diversity, it's only because of these museums and herbaria. And in present times, especially in climate change scenario, these herbaria and museums, they have been put to many different uses. What was not, say, 100 years before, if you had collected a specimen, you are not knowing that tomorrow it may be used for, say, investigating whether climate change has shifted the phenology of a particular plant or not, flower or not. These are the different uses. Say ancient DNA. Ancient DNA is now becoming one more area where from these museum specimens and herbaria are used. Other than this herbaria, we are providing the service of identification, because scientific identification is crucial. Whatever you do, there are many researchers who have done their degrees, but after publishing many of their findings, at the end of the day, they come to know that their scientific identification was wrong. What we do, what we provide to the general, whosoever comes here, we provide the identification, scientific identification, although it takes a little bit time because we are too much occupied with teaching and other assignments, but we always welcome the scientific identification services of our center. In addition to that, there are a lot of students also, college students, students from higher secondaries and schools who come to the botanical garden and herbaria. They visit there, and this is basically an effort towards the environmental education. This is in a nutshell what our Center for Biodiversity and Taxonomy does.
I have a follow-up from Kesang only. For the viewers, I would want to tell you that Kesang is all the way watching this from Bangalore, and she is saying, she's asking what are the difficulties or cons associated with citizen science-based projects. Are there any difficulties or cons associated to it?
Let me be honest. Basically, I have not been affiliated with any citizen science initiative. I'm not qualified to talk much about this. There may be some say, I can't talk. Sorry, I can't talk much about because I don't have any experience in citizen science as of now. But I believe this is very important. I believe this is very important, and many times it came to me that we should start this citizen science here also, formal. But I believe the various social media groups that are working here for environment, that is basically the part of citizen science. That is other form of citizen science. Although we don't have that, say, formalized in a formal way, we don't do. But I know about one, this Bird Count India, eBird India. And that is basically the citizen science. We have members here from in Kashmir also.
Of course. We have another question from Mr. Sambandhan Kathirvelu. He's asking, has the biodiversity of J&K been explored, and to what extent has it been explored, and what is the percentage of it that is left out for us, and what are the reasons for such lacunae?
Again, a very difficult question to talk in terms of percentage, how much I can say. But it's the same. If we talk about whole India, southern part of India is much, I believe, I can say much scientifically explored and documented as compared to Himalayas. I am making a general statement. And same may be true in J&K also. I believe, say, disturbance of last 20, 30 years have not made feasible for the outsiders to work on the flora of this particular or biodiversity of this particular region. But of late, I believe there are initiatives, especially there's a crop of young scientists. I see a green light, I see a bright light. There are a lot of promising scientists, young scholars who are now trying to document the biodiversity of Jammu and Kashmir in different institutions, whether they are in universities or IIM or other institutions spread across Jammu and Kashmir. I believe there is in future we are going to have more and more documentation. I can't say this time what is the percentage that is still to be
Of
left.
course.
It's the same what is true for other Himalayan states.
Hmm. Hmm. We have a very interesting question by Malik Nisar. He says, how can we deposit plant specimens in Kashmir Herbarium from Rajouri and Poonch districts of Jammu? Is there any way of depositing these samples?
Yes. Mm, what they have to do, they have to, I believe Malik Nisar is a student of botany. He knows how to prepare a herbarium specimen. You have to collect it from the field, where from you have collected, you have to note down the details. Say if you have a GPS, nowadays in mobile phones, we have GPS enabled mobile phones. If he takes a pic and he keeps that GPS point along with its habitat, where from he had collected, then dry it, say simultaneously after a few days, keep it in the, usually we keep it in those newspapers, and then change those newspapers for 2-3 days till then it is completely dried, and then he can make a herbarium specimen of it, and then send it to our herbarium. If he wishes to have one voucher specimen, we give one number to him. That number remains always for that particular specimen. That means all times together for future. In cash herbarium, that specimen will be deposited under his name.
Okay. We have a question by Tahir Ghazanfar. He is a regular viewer of our talks. He says, how far have we done after the Britishers left us in terms of overall biodiversity exploration, taxonomy, and conservation? Any comments on that?
Very good question. But I believe I will be biased in this sense. Reason being, if I claim that for plants we have done much more since Britishers have done left, then I will say that in animals we don't have done much. Whatever Britishers have done, and that work is basically the reference. And then there have been, but we must also realize that the difficulties, and because all this research cannot come out of no money. You need funding, you need support, you need support of the state for such research initiatives. Uh, yes, Britishers did this because they had resources. I believe we here in Himalaya, in Jammu and Kashmir, we have many students, we have many research scholars, or even faculty members who are passionate about biodiversity. But only thing that is limiting them is the institutional binding or other assignments, or they don't have any funding, or many times they don't have any permission also. That's also one of the fact. But we should not be having sort of an inferiority complex that only Britishers did everything that and we don't do anything. We must also realize the resources that they had at their disposal. We have honest researchers here in Jammu and Kashmir, as well as in other parts of the country and world also. But I believe, yes, the base where from we start is laid by the Britishers. There is no doubt in it. There is no doubt in it. But we have moved a lot in filling the various gaps in documenting the biodiversity, at least from plant point of view, especially higher plant point of view. Anyway, this satisfaction word, where we can say that we have done satisfactorily, that is basically utopian. There is nothing like 100% perfection one can have. That's all what I can say to this question.
We have an important comment here by Yash Sharma. He says, excellent lecture reflects ardent need for the researchers to take up work in the field of taxonomy and conservation. Taxonomists in general have almost entered into the endangered category. So, you have any
Yes,
comments on that?
yes. I fully agree with Professor Yash's comment. In fact, unless we have this taxonomic workforce, till then we can't do any progress in say documentation of biodiversity. This is not true only for Jammu and Kashmir. This is true especially for the developing world, across the world. There is a dichotomy. This developed world, you have more taxonomists as compared to the biodiversity. In developing world, you have less taxonomists but more biodiversity. But there is a realization in the policy circles, in the government circles else also, that without taxonomy we can't move ahead. Although in initial years, previously in 90s, 80s, there was the craze for taxonomy had waned. Reason being that taxonomy was too much classical, but that classical is very important. Where from we have to, that is the skeleton that is provided by the taxonomy. But nowadays, taxonomy has not remained what it used to be, especially the two areas that have revolutionized taxonomy. One, the molecular data that we have now, and number second, the information technology, the graphics and the information technology. It has completely revolutionized it. Taxonomy is basically the informatics of biodiversity. It provides you the tools by which you you characterize a character in a particular. If you have a theater where a play is displayed, you have the different characters. Same is the case if you have on the earth, you have the biodiversity, you have the different forms of life. You have to characterize these biodiversity forms of life, and it's the taxonomists only and the only who will start its characterization. And luckily we have a lot of advancements in doing this taxonomy. And one thing that is really a point of concern is that many of these researchers, they are now not going too much into the field where actually the theater of biology is operating. I mean that actual happening is the process of biodiversity, the ecosystems. They are actually happening in the real field ground. If you start from there and then go to the lab and then do the highest advancement that have been come into the taxonomy in terms of graphics, in terms of statistics, and in terms of, you would say, analysis and then molecular data also, that taxonomy, what nowadays is called as integrative taxonomy, is going to be the future of characterization of the biodiversity, is going to be the future of the documentation of the biodiversity. In India also, we are facing the deficit. I agree with Professor Yash that we need to have a strong push for this taxonomic workforce. Then only we can make any progress in the documentation of biodiversity.
Thank you. We have a interesting question. I would just like to know a few of your thoughts on this. It's by Veer Ferry. He says, "Is biodiversity conservation against the modernization?" I understand it's a totally different
Yes,
aspect where we can go to.
very challenging question.
Yes.
A very challenging question. It depends upon how you define modernization. If you define modernization, the clearing of forests and then constructing huge skyscrapers, then yes, for those who think in those lines, biodiversity conservation is against the modernization. If you think that by crisscrossing a virgin forest rich in biodiversity, which is the last remaining, say, habitat of a particular endangered species, you think that this road, constructing a road in the mountains, and then all the mountains, they cave in and they go to these water bodies and they do the siltation. If you think that is modernization, then it is against the biodiversity conservation. It is how you look. And that's why throughout the world there is a now realization that whatever I had deliberately kept a slide that SDGs, it is now realized whatever your economic and societal SDGs are, their central pillar is biodiversity. If you do not take biodiversity as central, short term you may have gains, but long term you will have always pains. That's how I can answer this.
Just I would say a follow up to the same question. This one is by Zafar Zahoor. He says, there has been mass extinctions in the past as well when there were no human life. Then why are we so much worried about extinctions if it is a natural phenomenon? So can you comment on this?
It's a question. If we answer this, it will fetch Nature or Science paper. Very good question. Yes, I always like that you challenge the conventional wisdom. I always like this. But if we see all the studies, the scientific studies, it's not one study, it's not two studies, it's hundreds or thousands or lakhs of studies that have been conducted. the signal of anthropogenic influences. The previous one, almost all, if we believe in science, I agree. We must be. It's not only the science objectivity. There has to be some other aspects, also the spirituality and other aspects. But all these evidences, all the scientific studies that have been done so far, they believe that these mass extinctions were due to some natural phenomenon. The five big that are called as. But the present one, what is believed that they are driven by, we are called them as drivers. All these drivers are because of the human activities, not the normal human activities, the human activities which have been for, say, gaining more and more economic, say progress in the shortest possible time. Yes, humans are at the top of the say biosphere. I agree. I too agree in a very, I can say, in a very restrictive manner. You cannot make humans suffering and then other organisms will. That's why nowadays you have a concept that is developing: one health. One health. What is one health? It's not the health of only humans, it's also the health of the other organisms. That's why they will not, those viruses will not come from those other organisms and then infect us. And that's why this one health concept is coming. And one more important point that will tangentially address this particular answer is that I believe that many of the things, many of the economic benefits, there are economic reasons. Let's talk if why humans should worry about this. There are not only the aesthetic, ecological, or environmental reasons which are not marketable that should be put forth for justification of the conservation of biodiversity. There are immediate economic reasons that is for the benefit of the humans that we must conserve this nature.
Sure. I'll take this as the last question for today and then we'll wrap up this session. This is from Eco Irfan. He's asking how much are we successful in integrating our work with other government departments such as Forest Department and uh, the Department for, I think, water, wetlands and water.
Very
And
important question. Very important question. This today's lecture, I thought, is one of the way how we communicate science with the society.
of course.
I have now realization also about this. Myself from botany, I relate to the plants. Many times there are many priorities for the government department, say forest department, and we don't know what are their priorities and what are their issues that they confront in the immediate ground. And that's why there has been a very in fact there is none interface between on one side the researchers, on other side the policy or land managers who have ultimately to implement this. uh, there are both way problems in it. There are both way problems. I don't think science, a very difficult question in this sense. Many times policymakers are hesitant, they will not come to the scientists. And scientists, because of their ego, I can say personal ego, will not go to these land managers or forest managers or other managers who are basically manning this. And therein is the role of civil society or the citizen science or those who can pressurize these. Ultimately, these policymakers, they are because of the political leadership. Unless you make it as a political movement, so that these policymakers also will be say forced that they have to take the science while devising various problems. In my case, personal experience of late, I am even at the policy level also nowadays. You have to. There are many programs with DBT, Department of Biotechnology, or MOEF, Ministry of Environment and Forests, wherein you have to make a partner from the line department. This is basically to bridge that gap. What is different? What managers want and what the researchers, scientists undertake. I think there is need for both the sides to come together, without which much of the research that we do cannot have immediate say applications in the field. I do agree there is a big gap. We need to bridge it. It will not start from one side. It makes two to tango always.
Of course. So I guess we don't have any further questions here. I would really like to thank you, Dr. Anzar,
My
for this
pleasure.
very wonderful talk and the question answer session that we had. It was a very eye opening session today, and I'm sure people have benefited from this talk. So, for our viewers, we are having a series of talk this week. There are a few speakers from Kashmir who will be speaking to us, and you will be notified about these in the future. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Anzar, for this. We're signing off. Thank you.